we'll first have Jamie Luke. Jamie is a PhD student with Kansas State University. She got her bachelor's and master's from University of Missouri and has had experience with ADM, American Farm Bureau, and was also an intern at USDA OCE in our office. She'll be giving us a talk on mitigating enteric methane emissions. We also have Nick Potter, a research agricultural economist in the Conservation and Environment branch at ERS. His research focuses on water and climate implications for agriculture. He will be talking about USDA's manure nutrient database and data for evaluating livestock impacts. Finally, we also have Zach Raff, who was a last-minute substitution for Christine Witt that's on maternity leave. So Zach would be covering that talk, and he is a research economist with ERS. His interest lies in environment effects of regulatory policy and land use decisions. He'll be giving us a presentation on climate-smart livestock management, rotational grazing. But let me quickly kick it off to Jamie. Jamie, why don't you go ahead? So we'll plan on doing about 15 minutes for each talk. We'll have some questions intermixed in between, but let's try to save some of we'll have more time at the end to have a larger group discussion. But Jamie, why don't I turn it to you? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'll go ahead and get started here. Can you see that all right?
Yeah, we can see it perfectly.
Awesome. Okay, well, like Sean said, I am Jamie Luke, a PhD student at Kansas State University. And today I'll be talking about reducing U.S. livestock enteric methane emissions, some economic insights, and remaining challenges that we see in this space. So to just kind of get started, what are enteric methane emissions? So here we have cattle that are feeding in a feedlot. So cattle are ruminant animals, which means they have a rumen as part of their digestive tract. So when they eat, feed travels to the rumen, and in order to break down that feed, there is a fermentation process that takes place. And a byproduct of that fermentation process is the production of methane. And in order to get rid of that methane, it is exhaled into the environment by cattle. And cattle aren't the only ruminants. We also have sheep and goats and others, but kind of beef and dairy cattle are kind of the forefront as far as this topic in the US. And that matters because methane is a greenhouse gas, of course. And when we look at kind of the grand scheme of total US greenhouse gas emissions, we see that over 3/4 of those are in the form of CO2. However, next after that is actually methane. So about 12% of all US greenhouse gas emissions come from methane. And if you break down that 12% a little bit further, you'll see about 1/4 of it comes from livestock enteric emissions. So about 3% of all US greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock in this form. So if you break that 3% down further, about 1/3 of that, or not quite 1/3, comes from dairy cattle, and the remainder from beef cattle, with a little bit from both sheep and goats and other ruminants as well. So that's kind of the grand scheme, what is going on here with enteric methane emissions. And this matters when we think about kind of the outside pressures that there are right now to reduce emissions kind of across the board. So specifically for methane, we've seen pressure from the government. So the US and the countries of the European Union kind of spearheaded this initiative called the Global Methane Pledge that the US signed back in November of 2021. And its main goal is to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030 as compared to 2020 levels. So over the next, or over this decade, hoping to have kind of a substantial decrease in methane emissions, not only here, but around the world, as over 100 countries have signed this pledge. Also, we see the private sector. So globally, over 1,500 firms, many of them major US firms, have pledged net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then we also see kind of the consumer piece of this. So a lot of work done in the ag-econ field has shown that there is a subset of consumers out there who are willing to pay more for products produced via climate-friendly production practices. But again, that's just a subset of consumers. So it does kind of beg the question, at the end of the day, who's going to pay for this? And we'll kind of get a little bit more into that here in the next few slides. But with all of this pressure to reduce emissions, we've also seen a lot of kind of innovation in this field. And specifically, when we think about mitigating enteric methane emissions, today I'm going to be talking about a lot of research and development that's been done in feed additives specifically. So these additives kind of come in two different forms. So one being methane inhibitors. So what these products do is just block the formation of methane in the rumen from the get-go. So a couple of examples here would be one, the synthetic feed additive 3-nitrooxypropanol, or 3-NOP. And then also a lot of scientific studies have been working on understanding the compound bromoform in red seedweed and how that also has mitigating characteristics. We also have rumen fermentation modifiers as another category of feed additives. And rather than blocking the formation of methane, it kind of just changes how the rumen processes feed. So example of these would be ionophores or tannins. And so like, for example, an ionophore kind of just improves feed efficiency, and in that we get a methane reduction. So this is not an exhaustive list. There are others that I could have included here, but these are kind of maybe some of the top ones that are kind of in the news or in the scientific community right now. And maybe one of the most promising and one that's not yet approved in the US would be the synthetic feed additive 3-NOP. And I'm going to go a little bit further into kind of the talk around this additive, just because I think it's kind of interesting and maybe it's kind of leading the way as far as a potential additive that could be used in this space. So 3-NOP is a compound that is owned by a Dutch company called Royal DSM. And on their website, they claim that it reduces enteric methane emissions by up to 45% when included in beef feedlot rations and up to 30% when included in dairy rations. And it's an interesting product because it's generally considered production neutral. So we don't really see any positive or negative effects as far as production. But kind of the main thing is just that it reduces emissions. So maybe a difficulty in this space is that it's not something that's super tangible for a producer because you can't really see emissions or see that they're being reduced. You just kind of have to trust the science. It's licensed under the name of Bovaer, and in the US, Elanco owns exclusive licensing rights. However, like I said, it's not yet approved here, but it has been approved in a lot of other major livestock countries. So Australia, Brazil, and also the countries of the EU, as well as some others. So it is pending FDA approval. So FDA, when it first was introduced, 3-NOP, considered it to be an animal drug instead of a food additive. And that matters because this increases the approval process. So an animal drug typically takes between 8 and 10 years to get through the process. So it would be 2030 or beyond before 3-NOP saw the market in the US, whereas food additive is more like 2 to 3 years, so substantially shorter. However, this past year, 14 US senators wrote to the commissioner of the FDA calling for a change in that classification. And kind of the latest word on the street that I've heard is that approval for 3-NOP is potentially coming in the middle of next year. So I think summer of 2024, this could potentially be a product on the market here in the US. But kind of the million-dollar question is, will producers adopt it? So some necessary but not sufficient conditions for adoption, and this is kind of in technology across the board, is sound science and government approval. So for 3-NOP specifically, potentially by middle of next summer, those two will be checked. However, it's important that we also think about the economic incentives behind it. So simply having sound science is likely not going to get producers to adopt. We have to go further and think about what it means to their bottom line. And I think that this is an interesting kind of point here. The New York Times a couple weeks ago did an article on how a lot of the major food retailers and restaurants in the US are not reaching those emission goals that I referenced earlier. And they kind of ended the article, and they kind of hit at, I think, what the crux of this problem is. And it kind of ended with, it comes down to who is going to pay, right? So while there is a lot of pressure coming from all these different areas, at the end of the day, someone has to foot the bill for producers changing practices in a way that is, expensive or more costly than what they're doing right now in order to reduce emissions. So some additional insights when it comes to adoption. Dr. Tonzer, my advisor, and I have an ongoing grant with USDA's Office of the Chief Economist. And as part of that grant, we conducted some stakeholder interviews kind of in the plain states of the US. We got in touch with representatives from Kansas Livestock Association, Nebraska Cattlemen, and Texas Cattle Feeders Association to kind of pick their brains about this topic and what it looks like from a producer's perspective. And some key takeaways that we found from those meetings was, one, that producers are aware of this emissions topic, but it's not currently something that's front of mind, especially at a time when we're in really tight cattle supplies. And we also see drought persisting in a lot of major beef producing areas. Those are things that are really prioritizing the space of producers. And emissions is something, given the lack of economic incentives, that we really just haven't seen become a priority yet. We also found in these interviews a lot of diversity within operations. So heterogeneity, but whether it be in who the operator is, their demographics, the size of operation, kind of how they go about production decisions. And what we found is that there's likely not a one-size-fits-all strategy in this space. Excuse me. And going forward, policymakers, people who have the ability to pull levers in this space, need to kind of keep that in mind and not pigeonhole producers into one specific strategy. And then also going forward, there's this lack of kind of understanding of producer decision-making as far as environmental concerns in the livestock space. We see some literature on this in the crop space. So things like cover crop, no-till, there's some economic literature out there on that side of things, but we see less of that in the livestock space. So we just have a need to better understand kind of where producers are on this topic. And then, like I've kind of hinted at, there's currently no clear economic incentive for a producer to adopt an emissions mitigating feed additive. However, if those were to be put into place, they could come in a lot of different forms. And I'll go through just a few of those potential forms here. So the first being governmental support. So just this past month, USDA released their Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Mitigating Activities list for the fiscal year of 2024. And importantly, what they added on this list is feed management, which means that going forward, this could open up the use of methane mitigating feed additives to IRA or Inflation Reduction Act support. So IRA had funds for NRCS to kind of bolster some of their programs. And so going forward, now we could see that a feed additive could be included likely in the EQIP program. There's currently not any conservation stewardship program activities that would include feed additives. So it would probably be on the EQIP side of things that we could actually see maybe an economic incentive for producers. However, some additional insights kind of on this topic itself is that in these interviews that we did, we would ask producers, if you could rank like where an economic incentive would come from, how would these things kind of shuffle out? And across the board, it was very clear that government assistance would be at the bottom of that list. So ideally, it would not come in the form of government assistance. Ideally, it would be some sort of market function that created an economic incentive. One beef cattle producer quoted said, "Receiving government assistance is not in our culture." However, we have seen that this may be changing. So for example, with the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, about a third of those payments went to livestock producers. We've also seen increased enrollment in LRP, likely due to increased subsidy levels there. But having said that, it may be that going forward, producers are more open to kind of that government involvement in their operation. The next incentive I'm going to talk about is carbon markets, and I am not an expert on carbon markets. However, I do have kind of some high-level insights that I can offer. So specifically for the 3NOP product, Landco, given that they have licensing rights, has partnered with a startup called Athian. And Athian's main goal is to help farmers monetize their emissions reduction. So basically allowing them to take credit for their emissions reduction. However, uncertainty remains in quantifying and verifying environmental impact of feed additive use. So whenever I talk to animal scientists or environmental scientists in this space, and I ask, okay, what is, like ballpark, how sure are we with these emissions reduction numbers? Typically, I've never got the same percentage, but it's always less than 100%, right? There's always this, like we're getting there, but we're not quite there. So I think there is some room for the science to still be catching up with kind of what we are actually seeing as far as emission reductions when we use some of these technologies. However, there may be help coming in this area. So the IRA also provided $300 million in funds to USDA to improve their greenhouse gas measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So it could be going forward that we'll be getting a lot better estimates or maybe more precise estimates in this space. And then finally, the final potential incentive I'm going to talk about is consumer demand. So climate change is very much so a societal discussion. Kind of everybody has skin in the game. So it may be that a vote buy gap exists. So at the end of the day, consumers say, yes, I have concern and I want to see reduced emissions, but are they willing to pay for the changes that a producer would have to undergo in order to reduce their emissions? And this is kind of an unknown because up to this point, we hadn't seen a lot of products be put on the market with environmental claims as compared to some other claims that we see on food packages. However, a recent product launched by Tyson in their brazen beef line does have a specific environmental claim. They say it has a 10% greenhouse gas reduction as compared to conventional production. So going forward, kind of inspecting some transaction level scanner data or something in that area could be really interesting. But kind of where we sit today, it kind of remains unknown what that looks like to a consumer. And we do have some insights from Kansas State that might kind of give us a little bit of an idea of what that looks like. So every year for the past almost 4 years, or I guess every month, Kansas State has done a meat demand monitor survey. And as part of this survey, consumers from across the US are asked, given the following list, please indicate the importance to you when purchasing protein items for your meals. And they have to rank them. So these are all relative rankings, but on average, you'll see the things there on the left are qualities like taste and freshness and price, things that are very tangible to a consumer. But if you look further down that line, it's things like animal welfare, origin, and then finally environmental impact. So things that are much less tangible to a consumer. So that just kind of goes to show that the average US consumer, if they rank price near the top and environmental impact at the bottom, then it's likely not the average US consumer that's going to be paying a premium in the marketplace for an environmentally friendly beef or dairy product. And granted, this survey is it's protein in general, so it's not specifically beef. But if we just kind of think about that in the beef market, it does kind of beg the question of, what does that market look like and how big is it? How much of a demand pull could there be for a beef product that's been fed a 3NOP? And we can look a little bit further into that data. So I took the first 3 years of meat demand monitor data and ran an ordered probit on kind of just the answers to the environmental impact ranking question. And for those who ranked it most important here, I have the marginal effects plotted, and the base categories are not listed here, but you can kind of get the idea. So for example, a target market potentially for kind of a climate-friendly beef product could be one, the younger generation is more likely to rank environmental impact most important as compared to older generation, those who reside outside of the Midwest, those who have children at home, so people who are interested in the future and the environment in the future, Then here in the middle, we have kind of those who aren't regular meat consumers, so flexitarians, vegetarians, and vegans. Some other characteristics, those who are unmarried, Democrats. So there is potentially a market out there for this sort of product. However, how big it is still remains to be known. Something that I also think is interesting is if we look here at that middle section and all of those alternative diets as compared to those who regularly consume meat, it may not be that those people are willing to vote in the grocery store by buying beef at a premium for reduced emissions, but they still have voting power. So if any of this were ever to come to like a policy measure that's being voted on by the general public, it doesn't mean that just because they're not voting with their dollar that they wouldn't be voting in the market, or excuse me, in the voting polls. So that has kind of informed what my dissertation work is focused on, because I mean, if you think back to the things I've talked about, there are a lot of unknowns in this space still, right? We're still kind of getting there, whether it be on the science or the economic side, but there is a lot of work in progress. So personally, I'm currently researching marketplace sentiment regarding potential climate adaptation strategies, both from the public and the producer side. So I've got a couple of upcoming surveys that are going to be coming out on the public side, exploring their willingness to pay for different climate claims on beef products, as well as their support for policy action in this space, and kind of teasing out any heterogeneity that may exist in those both the consumer side and the voter side. And then second, they're understanding producer adoption of some of these mitigating activities, given those incentives that I've talked about today at varying levels. And then finally, kind of understanding what that could look like from both the producer and the public side of things in the total beef market. So bringing it all together. So that's kind of just a quick overview that I have for today on the feed additive side of things. But I'd be happy to take any questions that y'all may have.
Thanks, Jamie. Very excellent presentation. Very good rundown of the economics of this situation. I just wanted to quickly welcome everybody again that showed up, that are popping up. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll try to intermix some of the questions throughout the in between talks, but we'll save most of it for the end of the Q&A. I did see there was a comment raised in the chat by Byron, had mentioned that there's typically a difference. Typically, there's a significant difference between willingness to pay and that actual transaction taking place. The price still matters. I think maybe a question for you, Jamie, is so you touched upon at the end the next steps in terms of looking at willingness to pay, maybe doing some choice experiments on that front in order to get more insights into this issue of the consumer demand for some of these products. I guess one question for you is, so as economists, we know that there's a difference between what people actually pay and what they're stated versus revealed preference. There is also, we've heard of that other product that just came on the market, the brazen beef that you've also mentioned before. That's by Tyson, and it's a new climate smart beef, claims to have a 10% less of a carbon impact than others. I guess kind of touching on Byron's question, I mean, first, I don't know if there's actual price premiums that are already out there based off of like brazen beef or similar type of products. How can something like that be used also, as an economist that is also looking at, let's say, doing a willingness to pay type of study to cross-validate, to get at that issue, what we actually pay versus, our stated preference, because this is, brazen, I don't even know if it's fully on the market yet, but we don't really actually have a good sense of whether a climate smart product, what the actual premiums is or what the actual demand is. I don't know if you can touch a little bit more about how you see that.
Yeah, good question. And that's something I have been grappling with as I've kind of gone down this route. So brazen is on the market. However, it's not widespread at all. I found it online at like a grocery store in New Hampshire. So kind of spotty here and there across the US is all I've seen. So that is helpful though, I think, because it allows you to kind of have a little bit of a potential benchmark as to what a premium could look like. So I don't know what it would cost for a processor to certify that this beef produced 10% less emissions, right? Like I don't even have a ballpark number for that. And ultimately, I mean, that's what they're going to base their premium off of, is what that actually costs. So being able to see, okay, this grocery store in New Hampshire is selling ground beef at $9.99. If we slap this label on it, that is helpful just to know that, okay, maybe it's like if we look at other things in their grocery portfolio, maybe it's like a $4 or $5 per pound premium as compared to just a regular ground beef product. So I do think that there is potential for it to inform the choice experiment. However, like you said, there's always kind of the issue with, people will say they'll pay for a lot of things, but in the actual marketplace, in the grocery store setting, are they willing, or even in the restaurant setting, are they willing to do so? So yeah, I mean, I think that it does, it begs an important topic, like an important question here of how do we make this realistic to a consumer, but also lacking information on our end of not knowing, what an actual premium could be. How expensive is it going to be to certify that these cattle have had this production practice? So there are a lot of unknowns, but I do think that we can use some of these products that maybe are being introduced right now to inform our choice experiments better.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. I'm going to actually quickly move on to Jeff, and we'll save more questions for Jamie at the end. Jeff, do you want to go ahead?
Everybody, thanks, Sean. Sean, do I control the slides?
Yes. Yeah, if you can just do it on your own. Yeah.
I should put my slides up. Okay. Let's see here. Okay.
You can see it.
Okay, let me try to zoom it so that it's full screen. Okay. So, hey everybody, Jeff O'Hara. I'm the Deputy Director in the Office of Energy Policy, and this is the USDA's Office of the Chief Economist. Thanks for joining our webinar today. My presentation will be on the participation of anaerobic digesters in environmental markets. So I think we, and there's going to be a little bit of overlap here with what Jamie and the other presenters are presenting on. We're all kind of focusing on the need to reduce
Jeff, we actually have you showing on presentation mode. I don't know if there's a way you can adjust it just so you're showing your slides.
This. All right. Well, I don't.
Yeah,
does this show up?
I mean, if you just want to do it
like from beginning, right?
Yeah, but now you're not in now you're not in slide view. I mean, you're not actually in the the
this.
No.
Can you see the slides or no?
You can see the slides. It's just not showing in the whole screen.
Do you know what to hit? Or should I just keep going?
On the top, it says display settings, Jeff.
Yeah.
Try clicking that. And
Swap presenter view and slideshow.
Yep, that's exactly. Yep.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Thanks, Maya. Sorry, so used to Teams on my end too. Go ahead.
So digesters, I'm focusing on, the interest in digesters is they're the only, climate smart farming practice with what has materialized as a standardized protocol in important U.S. environmental market programs. And particularly, we're going to focus on the ones in California which have had the most traction to date. So forestry offsets have also, seen some. There have been a lot of credits issued for forestry projects in California's cap and trade program, and there's been a fair amount of research on forestry projects. We've seen far less attention focused on sort of which digesters have participated in environmental markets, and that's one of the things we want to focus on here. So this is going to repeat some of what Jamie had. There's just for people that aren't sort of immersed in how all the types of ways in which livestock production leads to greenhouse gas emissions, I just wanted to provide an overview which repeats some of what Jamie said. So there's enteric emissions, which Jamie just covered. That's almost 200 million metric tons of emissions from that, and that's 3% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And that mostly comes from ruminants. So that's about 3/4 of this is from beef, about a quarter or so is from dairy. Manure methane emissions come from the anaerobic decomposition of manure. So this is another 66 million metric tons. Dairy is the largest source of this, as well as swine. So these two types of greenhouse gas emissions come from dairy and swine farms. Poultry is much smaller. There's also nitrous oxide emissions from manure when ammonium oxidizes. So this is a smaller amount here. And then I know we're also going to have a presenter here that's going to talk about grassland management practices. And grassland management practices can potentially influence soil carbon levels. And so that's another form of greenhouse gas emissions that can be influenced by the way in which livestock is managed. So we've seen a big increase in manure methane emissions in the US. So in 1990, we had a little under 40 million metric tons. And by 2021, over a period of 31 years, this jumped to about 66 million metric tons. Most of this growth occurred in dairy. So you can see, and that's dairy's represented in the blue bar on the chart. So there were big shifts in dairy production over this 30-year period. We've seen far fewer number of dairies in the US. We also know that dairies have been shifting away from pasture-based systems towards confinement systems. We also know that dairies have been shifting, away from the Northeast and upper Midwest towards the western parts of the US. We've also seen during this time productivity increase. So this is by almost 50% over a 30-year period, which is really remarkable. We've seen sharp increases in productivity. Enteric emissions over this time were largely unchanged. Maybe there was like a 4% increase in enteric emissions or so. And the reason for that is that enteric emissions decline or don't increase by as much as productivity goes up. We did see, fairly large increases in manure emissions as due to this shift towards confinement systems. Still, it's really important to note that if you looked at the manure emission intensity of milk production, which is to take greenhouse gas emissions and divide it by the amount of milk that's produced, globally, the US is one of the most efficient systems. So if we look at the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk produced in the US, this is actually very favorable for the US. And actually, this chart shows that these trends can vary quite a bit across states within the US, and these trends vary. So in the early 1990s, the Northeast, which is represented kind of as the New York, Pennsylvania line, in the upper Midwest, which is sort of Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then other parts of the US where systems were predominantly pasture-based. Over a 30-year period, the manure emission intensity of milk production increased as those systems. So this is because, we saw fewer pasture systems. There was a shift towards confinement systems. In other parts of the country, particularly California, Idaho, and Texas, which are sort of large dairy states in the West, that are already more confinement systems, these systems, saw big increases in productivity, but due to the way they were set up, they didn't increase manure emissions by quite as high. So we've seen some convergence across the U.S. in terms of the manure emission intensity of milk production, so that by around 2020 or so, the levels are across states, so the differences have gotten much smaller. So what are anaerobic digesters? So if you have a manure lagoon, the anaerobic digesters will seal the lagoon, and then this biogas will pop out of the lagoon, which is, the biogas has about a large proportion of the biogas is methane. Methane is a biogas with a high global warming potential. There's also some CO2 and some other gases mixed within there as well. And so that biogas occurs from the anaerobic decomposition of manure. So, and instead of letting that biogas escape into the atmosphere, it's captured and then it's transported to a digester. And this manure can also be co-digested with, sort of either water or residues or other kinds of food wastes or, things of that nature. So once the biogas is captured, there's sort of different things that can be done with it. So one is just to flare it. And this would be essentially burning it off and not using it. So this converts the methane into CO2, which from a global warming perspective global warming accounting perspective is a good thing. The drawback with flaring, though, is that it doesn't allow farms to, generate any additional revenue with capturing that biogas. So it can be combusted for electricity and heat. And that's sort of what older digesters did. And what newer digesters are doing are essentially cleaning the biogas, which is essentially taking many of the non-methane emission gases out of it, and then injecting it into a pipeline where it can be used for compressed natural gas. So, offsets. So I think people here probably know at this point what offsets are. People that follow agricultural economics know that cap and trade programs have allowed offsets to displace point source reductions from emitters. So I would say in the mid to late 2000s or so, 15, 20 years ago, offsets were conceptualized as a really important way to support climate smart farming practice, particularly when there was a sense that greenhouse gases may in fact be regulated through cap and trade programs. We had just experienced all the success from the acid rain program with sulfur dioxide, and maybe something analogous would be developed for greenhouse gas emissions. We all know that never really materialized, but still it's the case that for digesters in particular, many of the conceptual issues with setting up a protocol are straightforward. So additionality, which is, is straightforward to look at for digesters, given how few of them there are across the US relative to the number of dairy and swine farms. The ways to measure greenhouse gas mitigation is relatively straightforward. You can measure the flow of biogas as well as the methane concentration within the biogas. And, with soil carbon practices, these can sort of be tricky from an accounting perspective, because if the practice discontinues, that sequestration that was credited could potentially be reversed. And so with avoided methane emissions, you don't have to work through that potential of reversal if the practice discontinues. And so for these reasons, digesters are the only, really climate smart farming practice that have ever have a standard protocol developed in a regulated cap and trade program. So there's really two main, up until this year at least, there were two main cap and trade programs. One was the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. There was a protocol developed for digesters, but it's never been used. The RGGI has been sort of plagued by low market prices due to this oversupply of credits for a fairly long time. There's also a program developed in California, and so while the point sources are within California, the offset program has national implications. This is because digesters across the United States could be eligible for offsets under this program. So even though the point sources were within California, they could purchase offsets from an out-of-state digester. So prices here have been much higher than they were in RGGI. They're currently around $37 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So far, 100 digesters across the U.S., which is 26% of total digesters, have received credits in these programs. And 62 out of those 100 digesters are from the Midwest and Northeast. So a fairly low number of digesters from California. We've also seen a high number of digesters from Idaho getting credits there as well. Unfortunately, at least from the perspective of offset credits, the California Air Resources Board, which is the agency that regulates the cap and trade program, has gotten heavily criticized for letting offsets in their program. This has been a huge source of controversy, and due to this sort of pushback they're getting by allowing offsets, they have developed new rules to restrict the use of offsets. So beginning 2 years ago in 2021, they cut the amount of offsets that regulated sources could use from 8% to 4%. They also are, in addition to that, they're also restricting out-of-state offsets. So they're saying that at least half of your offsets have to come from California-based projects. So For digesters, this means the digester has to be within California. And so this has been led to a big reduction in the number of offsets issued through that program to anaerobic digesters. The good news for some digesters is that we've seen biofuel programs take, sort of step into their place. And actually, in recent years, really the number of credits issued in biofuel programs has far exceeded that in digesters. So the way that this works is that biogas converted to compressed natural gas can then be sold at fueling stations, and it can displace petroleum-based natural gas as a source of fuel. It can also displace landfill gas, biogas from landfills. So there's been some state programs in California and Oregon have had programs California's programs called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And Washington State just developed a program that launched this year, and other states are going to develop similar programs. And so they mandate the average carbon intensity of fuel sold in the state. And then if you have a fuel with a low carbon intensity, you get credits, and you can sell those credits to producers with, fuels with high carbon intensity. So this differs in a very fundamental way than the EPA's renewable fuel standard, which is really, oriented around volumetric mandates. And so you would, the way the EPA works is that you set sort of levels of fuel, quantity levels of what fuels can be allowed, and then credits are issued that way. And so within the RFS, biogas is considered a cellulosic biofuel, so they get something called a D3 RIN. D3 RIN is just the name of the credit within the RFS for which digesters are eligible. And so, when the RFS was set up, there were, I think, great hopes that we'd see these cellulosic feedstocks like miscanthus and switchgrass sort of emerge as cellulosic biofuels, and then that never materialized. And so we're seeing more and more biogas from landfills, and then in the last several years from dairy digesters also getting those credits and also getting D3 RINs in their place. And so the low carbon fuel standard has actually turned out to have a very profound impact on the number of digesters in the US. So the reason for this is that dairy digesters get credit for displacing the fossil fuel from the natural gas side, but then they also get a credit for avoided methane emissions. So and effectively, they're getting a credit within a transportation policy for a best management farming practice. So LCFS prices had really shot up in 2020. They exceeded $200 per metric ton. The last 3 years or so, they've fallen to about a third of that. But still, it's the case that this really large price spike led to really high revenue opportunities for dairy digesters that were producing CNG or that were producing biogas for injecting it into a pipeline. And you can also get LCFS credits and RINs at the same time, so that you can stack those credits because you're getting in the LCFS, you're getting credit for the avoided emissions. You can't get both LCFS credits and offsets. So this is a second reason why we've seen the switch away from digesters getting offset credits to LCFS credits, is due to the fact that the avoided emission credit could potentially lead to double counting if you allowed those credits to occur in both markets. So we have 47 CNG pipeline digesters have an approved LCFS pathway. This is 34% of the overall universe of CNG's pipeline digesters. And I mentioned that historically there were a lot of digesters in the Northeast and Midwest, and so in the last 5 years we've seen a fairly large growth in digesters. There were not, even though California is the biggest dairy state, there were not a lot of digesters in California historically due to air permitting and regulations and other reasons like that. So this is just a chart, kind of concept showing what's occurred in terms of environmental credits. So the red bar is going to be annual level of offsets, and then the gray bar is LCFS credits. And so in 2015 to 2017, there were about 1 million metric tons per California Air Resources Board issued about 1 million metric tons per year of offsets to digesters, and then that's just declined over time. And so and we can see starting in 2019 in particular, they started giving more and more credits to LCFS credits to digesters, and so by 2022 they gave out almost 4 million metric tons worth of credits to in the LCFS to dairy digesters. And then the other axis shows D3 RINs. there's D3 RINs and LCFS credits essentially follow the same path. That the number of D3 RINs that the EPA has given out to digesters has also spiked in the last couple of years. And so this trend has contributed to this increase in the number of digesters. So we saw throughout sort of the mid 2010s, there were really no changes in the number of digesters year over year. There was no real appreciable increase in digesters as this offset protocol developed. But as we've seen the LCFS credit program take off, we've seen, if you look at the blue part of the bar, which is the number of CNG digesters, we've seen that increase quite a bit in the last 5 years. And so in the last 5 years, the number of digesters in the US has gone from around 250 to over 400. So it's a 65% increase or something like that. And we know that these numbers are probably going to be higher going forward. We also know that a lot of digesters have never gotten credits from California Air Resources Board, 61%. So we also know that environmental markets don't work for all digesters because of either transaction cost or just a lack of familiarity with the protocols. We know that older digesters are concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest, recent growth in California. So I think I've already indicated that.
Yeah, so we do have a question in the chat real quick. I don't know if you want to quickly clarify that from Lana. You look at the chat. This question.
In the chat. I'm a little bit confused. Yeah, so both credits, I didn't explain that well. So both programs are currently being administered. The prevention of double counting of credits has to deal between the LCFS and the offset program. But you can get both D3 RINs and LCFS credits for the same project. Yes. And that's something that currently is being done. We have seen a lot fewer digesters on swine farms relative to dairy. So many of the digesters historically and also the recent growth has come on dairy farms. So the economics of digesters aren't as favorable on swine farms. We also know that older swine farms were more likely to get grants. There's been some research that's shown that. We've also, in some of the more recent digesters going on to swine farms are collecting manure. There's one in Utah that I think is collecting manure from like 26 farms. So it's not the case anymore that new digesters are associated with a single farm. They are sort of aggregating manure from across multiple farms. And because of the scale, it's changed kind of the economics of installing digesters. So I think I have one more slide, and then I'll wrap up. Let's see. So going forward, so, I'm kind of repeating this point here, where digesters are the only climate smart farming practice that have gotten offsets in a regulated cap and trade program, but it didn't really lead to a change in the number of digesters in the US, and it doesn't seem like this is going to be something that's promising for the next few years for digesters. The LCFS prices have gone up. In 2022, the Air Resources Board issued 10 times as many LCFS credits for digesters than they did for offsets. We've seen LCFS prices fallen, but these programs are coming on in other states. And recently, we've seen that the California Air Resources Board may move to stop giving credits for avoided methane emissions to digesters beginning in 2040. So they're going to effectively encourage digesters for the next few years to get built under this protocol, but eventually that crediting formula may get phased out. The California Air Resources Board may also put in restrictions, effectively limiting digesters that can get credits to those sort of in the western half of the United States, and make it less feasible for digesters in the eastern half of the United States to participate. Something that is being talked about but hasn't been finalized. The Environmental Protection Agency proposed an ERIN provision when they released the draft rule for the RFS. And essentially the way this would work is that a vehicle charging station, if you have a vehicle charging station and you're an electric vehicle manufacturer and you source your energy from RNG, you could get something called ERINs, electronic RINs. Now that's an interesting protocol because that could potentially open the door for smaller farms that don't have pipeline access to get credits in biofuel programs. But the EPA didn't finalize that rule when they finalized the set rule, so it's still kind of unclear whether a rule like that may ultimately come into fruition, and if so, how it might look. But it's something that our office is tracking closely. So that wraps up my slides. And sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
Oh yeah, thanks, Jeff. Very interesting. I think there's so many interesting issues to unpack here. Again, if anybody has any questions, just raise their hand. I have a quick one for you, Jeff. I was wondering actually if you can quickly touch upon the cost side. I mean, we know that these anaerobic digesters can be expensive. I recall that Aaron Smith, he had on his blog, he had calculated, according to his calculations, the cost of the anaerobic digester, so about 10 times the market value of the gas it produces. I'm just curious, is that kind of consistent with your understanding? I mean, or more maybe okay. So maybe a question for you is maybe if you can put into context the carbon intensity scoring, surrounding related with the biogas with the anaerobic digesters and how that relates to the overall cost and some concerns being raised also to the size of the subsidy. I wonder, not to put you on the spot, but if you can touch upon some of that issues.
Yeah, so several years ago when LCFS prices were $200 a ton, that it was the case that digesters were earning more revenue than the costs of the program, the cost of installing digesters through that mechanism, because they're also getting there's other sorts of subsidies available for digesters. So now digester prices have since then have fallen quite a bit since that initial blog. So that's no longer the case currently. When we saw the LCFS prices shoot up, there was also this big shift towards renewable diesel credits in the LCFS. So when the way the LCFS works is all these forms of transportation fuels are effectively competing with each other. So high prices might be good for digesters, but it's also good for other credit generators. And we saw this sort of deluge of renewable diesel credits. And that has really pushed back down prices. So in response to this price not collapse, but this big reduction in prices, the LCFS is looking at strengthening the targets. We're also going to, and there's going to be a lot, it sounds like in the next few months that the California Air Resources Board will be updating their rule as part of a broader update, and we might see, some changes coming in, and it's going to affect the economics of all these supplies, of all these sort of either credit generators or credit suppliers, and so it's something we'll have to see going forward. But I think but to Aaron Smith's blog and specifically those market conditions no longer hold.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, for clarifying that. So in the interest of time, let's quickly move on to Nick. In the meantime, Jeff, there is a question maybe you can address in the chat box from Lano related to the cattle-based carbon credit. But Nick, in the meantime, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm not familiar of what Lionel's referring to. Maybe Lionel, if you could elaborate, that'd be helpful.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Nick, yeah, please go when ready.
Okay, thanks, Sean. And how's that? That's good.
Great, perfect.
Okay. Okay, so thanks everyone. Great to see a good turnout for this. I'm just going to talk about some work that we've been doing on the manure nutrients database. This is a data product and a sort of series of reports that have come out of this that started back. Why are things not? There we go. Started back really looking at 1982 through 2007. So this draws on census data and attempts to quantify how much manure and resulting nitrogen and phosphorus is being produced, and then also what the assimilative capacity of the crops that are produced in these locations is, so we can kind of get a sense of what the excess amount of manure nutrients is. And this has implications for water quality, greenhouse gas emissions, sort of considering the environmental impacts of livestock operations. Historically, this data has been used by NRCS to inform funding decisions for programs that are focused on agricultural best management practices. It also lets us look at this kind of changes in trends over time. So we're getting concentrations in different areas and what that's doing to the amounts of manure being produced, as well as looking at comprehensive nutrient management plan adoption and total maximum daily loads. TMDLs are the amount of a particular compound like nitrogen or phosphorus that a watershed or a water source can absorb in a day without it sort of having adverse environmental effects. And that has been really useful in looking at conservation effects assessment project watershed studies. So what we want to do is update this for 2017 and 2022 Census of Agriculture data. And this is important both for kind of a continuous continuity of the data set, but also because there may be some changes in the past 10 years that we want to incorporate in this new effort. This is really a collaborative project between several different departments here. So the Economic Research Service is taking on the coordination and production of this new data set, but we're getting quite a lot of help from NRCS in particular, providing their code and methodology notes, which has been essential, but also some of the institutional knowledge about where they get their estimates from. And then we're also getting help from the Agricultural Research Service, which has been really helpful in contacting livestock experts to get a sense of what the coefficients are for manure generation for different animal species. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then of course, NASS has been key in providing access to the census microdata and their whole infrastructure for doing that, and then also helping us to ensure that we're meeting all of our disclosure requirements as we look to make this public. Okay, so just broadly, if you're not familiar with this idea of estimating excess manure nutrients, it follows a kind of what you might think of as a source and a sink model. So the source, the manure generation side, we're looking at a particular response. So a certain farm is responding to the Census of Agriculture, and they're providing us information on the number of each kind of animal that they have. And so we take those inventories and then we kind of use those to estimate the amount of manure being generated. That's the source side. The sink side is for that same farm, looking at the crops that they're planting and the yields that they're getting on those crops. And so there's a certain amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that we can attach to those yields. So that's the assimilative capacity of the crops. And so we get the ability to soak up, or the sink, that those nitrogen and phosphorus compounds can be kind of soaked up by the crops. So it broadly follows this process here. So for each observation, we have the inventory of dairy and beef cattle. We have chickens. We also have things like emus and deer and elk. So these are the number of each of these kinds of animals. We're going to take those and convert them into animal units, which is a 1,000 pounds of animal per year. So for something like dairy, the coefficient there is 0.73. So you need 73 dairy animals to give us 1,000 pounds of a animal unit. And that, sorry, to give us 100 animal units, so 100,000 pounds. And then we take that and multiply those by additional coefficients, which give us the wet manure generated and the nitrogen and the phosphorus. In contrast, something like a broiler, you need 382 broilers to comprise one animal unit, and those have 6 sort of life cycles per year. So in order to get to 100 animals units for a year of broilers, you actually need something like 25,000 animals. And then we use those same animal units to estimate the manure generated, and then the nitrogen and phosphorus. And then on the sink side, we have the yields for several different crops. So we've got our typical row crops, our forage, forage crops and then several specialty crops. We take those yields. So for corn, this might be a particular farm might report something like 170 bushels, and maybe they have 100 acres, so 170 bushels per acre. We can take those two plus and multiply those by the nitrogen and phosphorus assimilative capacity for grain corn. And then typically we're applying nitrogen and phosphorus at some level above the assimilative capacity because there's this efficiency. So we, maybe we apply 1.4 times the assimilative capacity for nitrogen because only a certain fraction of that nitrogen is actually going to be absorbed by the crop. And that gives us the total nitrogen and phosphorus that can be applied for these crops, and then the total amount that's being generated by the animals, which at the farm level gives us estimates of animal units and life cycles per farm, the recoverable and non-recoverable manure, and the nutrient assimilative capacity. Okay, and so then we can take those estimates at the farm level and aggregate them up. So if we want to be able to look at, say, within a given Huck 6, like a small watershed, how much more nitrogen and phosphorus are we producing than we are able to assimilate in that particular area, we can kind of add up all of those specific farm estimates, and that gives us a regional summary. And then from that, we'll generate several different outputs. So typically, we have a publicly available data product, and so that will run for the 2017 and 2020 census years. And then sort of a non-public facing data set that flows into several of the models that we use for other research and estimation, which I'll talk a little bit about, and then some reports that allow us to summarize the historical trends and changes in how we're calculating these things. So for this update, the particular thing that we're focusing on, so we just reached the point now where we are replicating the 2012 data, and so the next step is to do this same process for 2017 census data, but we want to be able to incorporate particular changes. And so we're really looking at do the coefficients that we're using for animal units and for manure generated and for nitrogen or phosphorus per amount of manure generated. Do those make sense now that we're looking at 2017 and 2022 instead of 2012? There are changes both in terms of farm practices in particular that might affect that, but also in terms of the feed that is being given to these animals that affect those outcomes. And then, so feed and feed additives, and then also just how we're handling manure storage, so that that can determine how much of that nitrogen and phosphorus is recoverable and where that is going. And then the sort of end goal will be to release this estimate. One of the important things that we're really trying to do here is synchronize the classification of animals and the classifications of farms in such a way that they feed nicely into some of these other modeling outputs. So we have the Conservation Effects Assessment Project APEX model, and then the Regional Environmental and Agricultural Programming model, both of which can take these outputs as inputs to those models to let us improve on that process. In particular, for the REAP model, this is might think of it a little bit like it's not quite an input-output model, but essentially we want to be able to measure these changes in certain agricultural practices and then see how that's going to feed out in terms of environmental impacts of those practices. So in particular, for the REAP model, what we're really interested in here is if we're varying different kinds of feed, how does that change greenhouse gas emissions, and how does that change the amount of manure? And we can use these manure nutrient estimates that we're producing to get a better estimate of how those changes in feed will change the manure and the nutrients being produced, and in particular where that will make a big difference or not. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the applications of these manure nutrients database that's been used. So they're helpful in generating estimates of anaerobic digester cost curves. So this is the increasing cost as we sort of increase the amount of emissions that we're reducing. they also have been used for estimating the amount of manure that could be applied to crops and how that might affect reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And then on the water quality side, a big way that they've been used in Sherry Spiegel's work with manure sheds, which are this image here on the right is kind of a couple of examples from this 2020 work of hers, but essentially looking at where are livestock really concentrated and where are we producing the most amount of manure and as a result the manure nutrients, and we can kind of get this regional collection of high intense nutrient production and then surrounding areas which don't have as much, and that lets us look at how those nutrients could potentially be redistributed to some of these outlying areas in a way that would improve our environmental outcomes, but also have potential positive production and economicals. And then they also can be used, and they have been used for phosphorus inventory, but an accounting of how much nitrogen and phosphorus we have in these different areas. Okay, and I think that's it for me. Thank you all, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
Thanks, Nick. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise their hand. If there is no questions, I'll ask you a quick one, Nick. Can you touch upon whether there's the regional differences in recoverable and non-recoverable manure, and if so, what drives those?
Sure. Yes, that's a good question. So there are kind of two things that determine, and I didn't talk about this, but one of the things that we are really hoping to do is get better estimates. Some of this will be drawn from the ARMS data of different manure handling practices. So there are two big drivers of the regional variation. One is just the type of farm. So if you think about, if we take sort of two extremes, you've got one farm that has cattle maybe out on pastures, they're widely distributed. That manure is spread out and is not is essentially not liquefied, and so the outputs from that are a little bit different, but it's also not recoverable. It's not something, you don't go pick up the cow patties generally and then try to do something with them. On the flip side, you might have a very concentrated cattle farm where they're gathering up the manure and storing it, and then the nitrogen and phosphorus implications of that practice are different. So regionally, you have variation in the types of farms that there are, and that can affect the manure and the manure nutrients. But then you also have variation in the types of manure handling. So we might have anaerobic digesters, for example, as Jeff was talking about, or some other different systems for storing that manure, and that can affect what the balance of those nitrogen and phosphorus compounds are.
Okay, thanks. Again, this is a really important data set that you're working on, and certainly inform many of these very critical questions that are coming up. So let's
Thanks,
thank Nick. Let's move on to our last presentation, Zach. Zach, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
All right. Is that good?
Yep, it's good.
Cool.
All
right. Thanks a lot, Sean. And thanks to the three panelists before me for knocking down a lot of the pins for me. So I might be able to be a little bit quicker. But as Sean said before, I'll be talking about rotational grazing and specifically the financial incentives, the backgrounds about surrounding this livestock management practice. I'm also at ERS. I'm in the same branch, conservation and environment branch that Nick is in, and so I'll jump right in. Let's see if there we go. Okay, so a little background. Nick said some of these things, but historically, livestock in the U.S. they've been grazed on perennial forage, right? So we're talking many years ago, the old traditional. When you think of livestock, you think of animals out on the land eating the grass, walking around, right? But over the last 50 years, and really more recently as well, the technological advances and economies of scale in livestock production have led to an extreme concentration in this industry. So where the animals are now is not spread out over the landscape and grazing on perennial forages, but instead the animals are typically in large confined operations or feedlots, right? So whereas we used to have animals all over the place and eating off the land, now they're mostly confined in large barns. So basically that agricultural land now, what is it doing now, right? Instead of having animals on the land, now it is basically growing the annual forages that are being used as feed, right? Being used as feed or for ethanol biofuels. So just an example using some NAS data. I pulled data on the number of dairy farms and the herd size in Wisconsin, of Wisconsin dairy farms. And what you'll see, this is just showing that where the animals are going, right? Rather than being spread out on fewer or larger operators, a higher number of operations, now they're all moving to these very large operations that are concentrated throughout the landscape. So in the 60s, right, you had the average herd size was much smaller, right? Something like 30 or 40 head per farm. Now you're moving up, right? Around 200 head per farm. And there's just less of these farms, but the ones that are around are now much bigger. And so what are some of the problems, right? So we're talking about, continuous living cover and climate smart agriculture. So when it comes to the current confined system, the annual forages are really causing a lot of problems. So the soil health problems, when you're replanting and you're digging up the forages every year, you're turning over the soil, right? This can really lead to the soil health problems. It can lead to sediment runoff, right? When the land is constantly being turned over, it's a lot easier to be brought away by rain and snow melt. And then there's also the carbon leakage, right? So we've talked about how there's methane emissions that come from basically when cows burp. Well, there's also going to be carbon leaching because it can be stored in the soils. And when you turn over the soil each and every year, then there's going to be that leaching. So, and then this is also the second point really gets to what Nick was saying as well. So the confined production system, it concentrates those manure nutrients. So I've done work on this again in Wisconsin, where we see, what's happening. Why is there water quality impacts? What's going on here? And what we notice is that there really is this concentration of what used to be manure throughout the landscape is now in single locations. So rather than having 10 dairy farms with 10 animals on each operation, the animals concentrate to the one spot. So maybe in school we heard, or from some old school wastewater engineers, that solution is the dilution to pollution, right? Well, it's a little bit true when it comes to animal waste. When it's spread out over the landscape, the assimilative capacity has not been reached. But when you put manure in, all of that manure that used to be spread out into one spot, then the farmers have to do something with it. And what they do is they spread onto very nearby fields, because this liquid form manure is so expensive to ship, and there's not really many programs to help subsidize the cost of shipping. Then they spread it around very close to the operation. And when the assimilative capacity of the land has been reached, then the rest of that manure nutrients is rushed off and run off when it comes to precipitation events. So what is rotational grazing then, right? This is almost, again, I challenge everybody to picture what you would think of when you think of livestock. And, you know, you think of the farmer going out with their coffee and the animals are all grazing around. That's actually what this push is. So rather than going down the road and seeing row crops, much like we see here in the Midwest, you know, it's corn and soybeans. Well, instead of that, you're putting the animals back on the landscape instead of these very large operations where the animals are in barns. So how does it work? So in rotational grazing, operators are going to move the animals between multiple paddocks. So you can picture a paddock as being basically a section of the landscape, a section of pasture or grass where it's going to be enclosed. So you put a certain amount of animals in that paddock, and then they're able to graze for a specific period of time. So you then have this fencing that you're going to move. Depending on the intensity level of the grazing, you can move that every few hours or every few days. And what this really does is you're taking the animals and you're saying, here's the place where you're going to graze for the forages, then move them to another place, and there's going to be then fresh forages for the animals to graze on. So this allows the perennial grasses, the legumes, the clovers, right? All of those prairie grasses that we talk about to regrow, right? And to establish deeper and stronger root beds, which is going to be a lot better for the soil health, for preventing runoff, for carbon sequestration, right? So there's been a lot of work done, a lot of popularity into cover crops recently. Cover crops would be sort of grazing light, right? Where you're taking these this continuous living color, adding it to the annual row crops. Pasture and rotational grazing, then you're keeping that as the sole feed for your animals. So the longer you let these paddocks rest, the less days that the animals are grazing in each paddock. As I mentioned, some livestock operators that have managed rotational grazing, they can be moving the animals around every few hours. So that's called more intensive grazing. So basic versus intensive rotational grazing. So here's sort of a picture of what you'd look like, what you'd see with this rotation. You'll see that the animals are in one paddock, and then the paddock to the left of them in this picture, that's being allowed to rest. And so you'll notice that the legumes, the grasses, they're growing and becoming stronger. So what are some of the benefits? It's basically the opposite of what the problems are, right? The perennial forages, much like we probably are all aware of, they create these deep fibrous root systems. They keep the soil in place. They build soil aggregates. And this is going to have the benefits of, right, stopping that surface water run, well, not stopping, but minimizing it, decreasing it, versus your annual row crops where the land is turned over and the sediment is then rushed away during precipitation events. And so they're also sequestering carbon. So think of annual row crops, nitrogen fertilizer, large source. So collectively, the soil sequestration benefits are not just in holding the soil carbon, but also in minimizing that minimizing the greenhouse gases, the carbon that are emitted as a result of manure storage and handling, right? Because as Nick said, there's no manure system that you'll need to have when the animals are just out on the land. The amounts are about the same as from your enteric fermentation. So unfortunately, there's not really anything you can do with rotational grazing when it comes to the cows burping, right? A burp is the same whether you're outside or in a barn. But there's this minimization of fertilizers and the soil sequestration from using perennial versus annual forages. And as I mentioned, yeah, it minimizes or eliminates the need for these livestock operators to store the manure in liquid form and spread it at the same time, right? So this is more of a water quality benefit, but you have your manure spread on the confined operations, typically in fall and spring. Well, that doesn't happen. It's going, the cow patties are being dropped all all seasons. So how are we using this? Are there actually rotational grazing operations in the United States? So there was a recent ERS report that looked at this on cow-calf operations, and what the authors find. So looking at the NASS data, there's about 389,000 operations in 2007, but that's declining, right? As I mentioned, the economic benefits, the economies of scale, the technology in livestock production has gotten so much better that this is generally thought of as as from what I've talked to people on the ground, this is archaic, right? Rotational grazing is archaic. We have technology now, so there's been a pretty precipitous drop in the number of operations that are using rotational grazing in the United States, and it represents about 13% of the 2 million or so farms in the United States. So this figure here is just from that ERS report. What you'll notice is that the regional variation is in the intensive rotational grazing. So as I mentioned, the better for the ecosystem services, for the carbon sequestration, for water quality, is to have more intensive rotational grazing, right? Where you have more frequent rotations and longer resting periods. So that's where you're really getting this geographic variation. The percentage is roughly between 20 and 30% of cow-calf operations that utilize basic rotational grazing. So then, right, we're talking about financial incentives. We're talking about, how can we promote these sorts of climate smart practices? Well, the on-farm economics when it comes to rotational grazing is actually pretty mixed. It's a mixed bag, right? When you have your confined or traditional operations, the main cost is feed, right? Well, you don't really have to pay for feed when you're using rotational grazing. But on the other hand, grazed animals, they do take longer if you're going to finish them strictly on grass versus corn finishing or annual feed finishing. And then also the physical land requirements are very, very high, right? When you're operating a pasture-based system, you need a lot of land. If you are going to use a traditional confined livestock operation, then you basically just need the area for your barn. So there could be a lot of upfront costs if you're going to use rotational grazing. And then there's also the opportunity cost, right? If you're practicing intensive rotational grazing, you're out there and you're changing fencing several times per day, right? You don't have to do that when all of your animals are in the barn. You simply, not simply, it's still a big undertaking, but there's just additional time values that you're using when you have rotational grazing. So as I mentioned, the evidence on the profitability is mixed. So a lot of work has shown that dairies in particular can be more profitable when using rotational grazing, again, because of that lack of a feed cost, but it could be less profitable than traditional or no difference, right? The evidence is all over the place. So like many production systems, best management practices, when the economics aren't purely internalized by the private supplier, then there needs to be some sort of financial incentive. So what are they, right? Jamie talked a little bit at the very beginning about the market for some of these climate smart products. The market for grass-fed beef, I'm sure that some of you have been at a restaurant or been at the grocery store and seen grass-fed, 100% grass-fed beef. There's absolutely a market for this type of product, right? So the U.S. demand for grass-fed beef for about $4 billion per year, and we import more than half of that. So there is certainly a market for individual producers to enter and to provide this product. There's market reports that are saying, well, this is expected to grow, right? We're really on the precipice of a lot of the things that we're talking about today when it comes to climate smart agriculture, when it comes to these the production of marketable products that are climate smart, that provide ecosystem services, the payment for these things. Well, this global market is expected to grow more than 4% per year with US. So if I'm a producer and I want to enter this market, there's absolutely a market that is differentiated from your traditional livestock products. So there's also the organic markets, right? So many of these rotational grazing operations are certified organic. The organic market is also growing amongst, you know, younger people. And these producers can still earn a premium over conventional products. So again, there could potentially be additional premiums to be earned outside of any sort of government assistance by certifying organic or by, you know, entering into this grass-fed market. So there's the conservation program payments then too are huge when it comes to grazing. So EQIP, so Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and the CSP, the Conservation Stewardships Program, they've been providing financial incentives for operators to participate in rotational grazing for some time. Just that from that same report, EQIP has provided over $1.66 billion to support rotational grazing over the past 15 or so years. So just an example from Wisconsin, this is the same for most other states, some general area, but you can receive something like $62 per acre for intensive grazing. So again, that means that you're letting each paddock rest for more than 14 days. And then you can also earn a substantial amount for publishing an approved grazing management plan. So the dollars are there if our operators want to participate in these markets. So here's just a summary. Most of this is for fencing.
Yeah. Sorry. So I know that we're approaching our time.
Yeah, sure.
No, but let me just say, so I know some people might have to jump off at 1:30. Please feel free to do so. And if you have questions, maybe just follow up with the speakers. I mean, I'll be around. I don't know the other speakers, if they can stick around a few more minutes to let Zach finish his portion. And I apologize again, Zach, in your front. But again, just recognizing that some people may jump off. Feel free to of course, reach out to the speaker. So sorry, Zach, go ahead.
Okay, no, I appreciate it. I understand. Like I said, the last couple slides actually are pretty, some people have talked about these things. So we have our carbon offset credit markets, right? Goldman Sachs has predicted that this could be a pretty large market in the next couple of years. There's also then the water quality. So again, we've focused a lot on the greenhouse gases and those markets and those financial incentives. The rotational grazing has, you know, it's kind of nice because it has air quality impacts as well as water quality impacts. So the producers can tap into multiple markets. So non-point source offset markets, right, where point sources can pay the land users to implement best management practices. Well, rotational grazing is one such practice because there's such phosphorus retention benefits at these operations. And then there's also some, lesser used but possible options. So the Audubon Society can label, your product as certified bird-friendly grass-fed beef. That could potentially command a premium. And then anecdotally, there's been certain banks that I've talked with farmers that they use where you can get low-rate loans, or you can get land loans where the ecosystem services that your operation is providing that can be used as your collateral for that loan. So then, like I said, my conclusion, right, rotational grazing is basically going back to the olden times of livestock management, where animals are on the land, you're moving them around. This provides many ecosystem service benefits, not just greenhouse gas mitigation, but also water quality, soil health, biodiversity, and the markets, the outlook, the economical outlook is actually pretty good for these types of operations, where the markets they're strong, expected to improve. You can command a price premium, but then also the providers, the operators, there exist many conservation dollars for you to grab from these programs that have been in operation for several years. So I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, so again, I recognize people may have to jump off. I'm free to stick around to the extent that the other panelists can. But I do want to just open this up for questions from anybody, or even the panelists too, if they just want to raise their hand and go and shoot away. I did. I mean, I did have one for you, Zach. This is, you didn't really get a chance to touch too deeply on the offset markets, and I think that's an interesting element that also links up with some of the things that Jeff had talked about for the water quality offset markets. Can you touch a little bit more on those, like how active they may be and how many there are for grazing?
Yeah, so I think they're very much like a lot of the carbon offset markets that we've heard about, where it doesn't necessarily seem like they're jumping off the page as of yet, where people are really actively using these. I think that it's we're moving in a direction where a lot of states are tightening up their point source wastewater restrictions. So when those point sources are faced with either participating in these markets or installing expensive tertiary treatment technologies, we could be moving in a direction where a lot more of the states are using these programs. So it's really an information salience thing as well, like a lot of the policies, right? If I'm a livestock operator and I don't know about this market, or if I don't know about potential payments, then it's very difficult for me to use those markets. So I think that we're moving in a direction where we're going to have a lot more of these markets in the future. And as long as livestock farm operators know about them, then perhaps the upkeep will increase. But as of now, most of these markets are focusing on, again, things like cover crops that have really been getting the attention in the news and the media and the research, and grazing seems to be a little bit behind, but I can see them increasing in upkeep in the future.
Yeah, thanks. And so I just have one more if nobody else has, and again, feel free if any of the panelists too, if there's any thoughts that you want to chime in on as well before we close. But I'm trying to link it back to the broader. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, yes.
I was just going to say, I've got a couple in the chat that I hadn't addressed, so I might just go address those real quick. So Gerald asked, with the brazen beef, is the 10% less greenhouse gas verifiable? So I have not seen that it has a USDA process verified program attached to it. In fact, I think the only thing that I've seen in this space that does have a PVP is a program called Low Carbon Beef. And they are now kind of that program is now overseen by the company Select Sires. So that's kind of, I think maybe in the future, we're going to be heading towards a direction where there is more maybe oversight on some of these things that people are putting on packages, but kind of that's where we are on that landscape right now. And then Scott asked private incentives for adopting these feed additives for increased feed efficiency. And that is actually a really interesting question. So we do see that. I think that's kind of a lot of these companies who are creating these products, that would be the goal, to have a win-win. So not only is it reducing emissions, but it's also a feed efficiency, so it kind of pays for itself. There is, so for like 3-NOP, a small feed efficiency gain, but likely not enough to cover the cost of the product. However, we do see with things like the ionophores that I mentioned, those products are put on the market not for reducing emissions necessarily, but reducing emissions is kind of a positive externality of using them. So for example, Meninsin is a common ionophore that's used in this space or in cattle production. And kind of what it does is, well, one, seeks to prevent coccidiosis, but also increase feed efficiency. And from that, there is also a methane reduction. So it's small as compared to that with 3-NOP, but we do see that there is kind of that trade-off, or maybe a positive externality that comes from some of these products. So I hope that helps answer the questions in the chat there.
Thanks, Jamie. Zach or Nick or Jeff, any other last thoughts you wanted to share?
I guess one question I have, Jamie, do you know, so my understanding of the brazen beef is that it's grass fed, right? It's sort of that's the reason for the GHG. Do you know if there's any of those feed additives that are contributing to that 10% reduction, or if that's just all coming from grass?
So I don't know the specific process or production practices being used behind it. And their website's pretty vague as far as like what is actually going into that, which is kind of across the board, I think, in this. A lot of people aren't giving away kind of their secrets, and maybe it could be because the science is still kind of being worked out. But I'm not sure. And I think also something that's interesting is, so while there are environmental benefits for grazing, if we think about the lifespan of a cow, if it spends more time on grass, it's going to take longer to be finished, which means more methane emissions. So there's another camp here who would say, well, we need to get cattle off of grass and into feedlots quicker so that we can reduce that lifespan of the cow and less methane is emitted. So there are like conflicting messages, I would say, like in even the scientific community on how we should be going about this. So it's really interesting to like have your perspective, but also kind of the feedlot perspective as well.
Okay, anybody else have any last thoughts they wanted to chime in on? Okay, well, thank you then. You know, very good discussions here and a pretty good turnout, and very fascinating research going on, and really excited to see what's to come of this. And I thank everybody for all the time, and particularly, of course, our speakers who all did an excellent job. So thank you everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks all.